Hi, I'm Irma Francis, and I'm joined by Bill Epperly. Hi, Bill.
Hi, Irma.
I'm so glad that you took time to meet with me today. I've taken a workshop with you, and I absolutely loved it. And the work that you're offering the public is amazing, and
Thank you.
I really appreciate you taking time to do this today.
Oh, my pleasure.
So if we could just start out maybe by you saying who you are and what you do and what are the services and teachings that you're offering people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I live in Chicago with my wife right by Lake Michigan, and I'm a spiritual mentor and guide to people. I have practiced mindfulness for many years, starting with Korean Zen, and then also very familiar with the Christian contemplative path. So for people that are exploring those paths, that's the kind of person that I often end up working with. People that may feel that they have grown beyond what the church has told them is possible, or their spirituality has just grown and blossomed to a place that has left them wondering what might be next. And those are the kinds of people I love to work with. And I also help people. One of the things I'm particularly excited to work with people about is when they're interested in awakening, some kind of embodied or non-dual awakening. That's something that I have experience with, and I enjoy helping people find that.
Could you expand on that a little bit? I know I read about that on your website. So how did you put it? Embodied?
Embodied awakening, yeah.
And non-dual, did you?
Right. So the secret of all the traditions is that a non-dual awakening, or awakening to our oneness and identity with everything, is the traditional end of the path. And in the Christian school, that's called mystical union or divine union or transforming union. And in that experience, which is also described in Buddhism as enlightenment or awakening, the apparent split between self and object disappears, and one knows oneself to be not different in essence from the nature of all reality. It doesn't mean that we awaken to realize I am God, but you are not different in essence. That each one of us is a face, you might say, of that one divine, each a unique face of it with their own unique perspective. Mm-hmm. And many people today are interested in non-dual awakening, but sometimes the path they take to reach it is very much pushing away from the body, trying to overcome, transcend, get beyond the limitations of the body, and that's very understandable. That's a big part of my path too. But what I'm saying, and what my colleagues are telling me, is that it's possible to enter into that state through the body and experience it as a body, as a human body-mind.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And you had personal experiences with this before you even delved into the spiritual arena?
Well, I had an experience in 1987, which is almost 30 years ago, at a talk I went to by a Benedictine monk, Brother David Steinelrast. He's going to be 90 this summer. And Brother David is just an amazing teacher. He has an amazing aura or energy field around him, so that just in his presence, everyone would feel this sense of being elevated and held by his presence. And so I went to a talk in Ann Arbor, and in the middle of the talk, I went as kind of a agnostic / atheist, getting more interested in my spirituality based on after a period that got me into 12-step, which I won't say too much more about that, but I like to drink a lot. I came back in through 12-step and was reinvestigating the church. I was born Methodist, reinvestigating all that, and here was Brother David, and in his presence I had a spontaneous opening to the sense of oneness and connectedness with everything. And I just remember I walked out from the talk, and there was the sky, and I was the sky. and there were the trees, and the trees were looking back at me. And that is what really set me on my spiritual path and marks the day that I really became an earnest seeker, because I saw through the illusion that the physical world is the only thing, the only reality. Yeah. So that kind of foretaste, even though the path to a stable realization of that connectedness or oneness, even though the path was long and arduous, having that foretaste gave me what I needed to know that it was there. Mm-hmm. And something about how absolutely natural and easy it was to be in that state. It wasn't there were no lights, there were no trumpets, there was still all the normal challenges of living as a human being, but it was also very beautiful.
Mm-hmm. So just for my own curiosity, a question came up as you were speaking. So would you say spirituality and that a spiritual seeker, what they're seeking is somehow to not feel separate? Because when you say non-duality and you say oneness, to me that in my mind goes to a place of not feeling separate, and then my next question would be, well, separate from what? So I'm just wondering, from the work that you've done and the people that you have worked with, what is it that would cause a person to seek?
Well, if I can answer the end of that before the beginning, I think what we're seeking is the realization, is our true self, a sense of connectedness to, if you like, God or spirit within, in our neighbor, and spread across the cosmos. Those three. And I think
that would be feeling not separate then.
Not separate from. Mm-hmm. And I think we have intimations that our nature knows that that's our real identity, that we are the one living through all these different faces and perspectives. Somehow deep down we know that and are almost defended against it, because the ego wants to be the head of the show and the most important thing. And the thing that comes with awakening is the ego is still there, but it has to realize there's something bigger that even it is participating in. And it's not able to control, here's the ego, but it's participating in this giant cosmic system, and not able to control that. And it has a choice, well, do I want to participate in this artfully and creatively, or do I want to stand there like a tyrant and say, no, this is my party.
Kind of like a toddler.
I'm supposed to be the star here. Yeah. I think very much like a toddler. So I think that I could see, so why do people seek? I could see it as a developmental necessity. Why do people want to stand up? Why do people, when they're 3, want to, feel themselves to be omnipotent and all-powerful? Why do people want to differentiate when they go off to college? It's like you don't ask a teen, why are you wanting to differentiate from me? It's just programmed in them. So I think in a sense, maybe the seeking is really of that kind.
Like developmental.
There's a developmental process, which in Integral we call the developmental process is called growing up. So growing toward human maturity in our understanding, thinking, growing the self-sense to full maturity. And then the other path that happens simultaneously is called waking up to our oneness with everything. So we have to wake up, or we have the invitation to wake up and a parallel invitation to grow up. And not just be a tyrant with non-dual access.
So that would lead me to this question then, and that you have all the answers. So what then prevents some people from never growing up, from never seeking and going beyond what sounds like could be almost an adolescent place, which may be the ego state, to develop further than that, because seems to me there's a lot of people that don't take those next steps.
Yeah, well, yes, there certainly are, and it could be environmental causes like war, famine, etc. It could be a cultural glass ceiling, where women are not encouraged to come into their power. That's changing now. We see the benefits, but still there are so many every culture has some kind of core beliefs in it that tend to be limiting about human life and freedom. Then there could also be core beliefs that come in from the family system, and there may even be biological causes that would make it harder for some people to grow to that, on the growing up path, to grow to that kind of full maturity. And there are, we could go there if you want to, but there are ways to psychologically test where a person is in that spectrum of growing upness. And something like 5 or 10% of adult Americans don't get past the egocentric stage. They don't ever learn to play nice with their friends.
Yeah. So other than the biological part, which would be maybe not a changeable thing, but I mean, it's been known, I mean, people being locked up in a prison have been able to go beyond the ego state and have spiritual awakenings. So there really is nothing that can stop that unless there is some kind of biological interference.
Yeah, that's right, and it's not right, as with any story, it's nature and nurture. And there are those exemplars who grew up in the very worst situation and yet were able to transcend it and turn it into gold.
Yeah.
So it's not all about having, thank goodness, it's not all about having a perfect childhood.
Yeah. So another question came up as you were talking, when you were talking about spirituality and it being developmental, that it's unnatural, kind of, we all have this feeling of this natural, authentic self. So, and this is a big question, where did we get lost from that naturalness?
I don't know.
Because for me, it's very natural to be kind of plugged into all of life and feel at one, and that blissfulness that comes with it. It's very natural, like nature. Like we have nature within us. So yeah, I guess there isn't like a quick 1, 2, 3 answer to that.
Well, my quick 1, 2, 3 answer is that we live immersed in nature, which is constantly reminding us through its presence of our nature, the one nature.
Yeah.
But these days we also live walled off from nature, afraid of nature, pushing away at nature, overcoming nature, transcending nature, subduing nature. And from that stance, which, I mean, I think there's a lot of good in the Industrial Revolution and in the Enlightenment. In the 16th, 17th century, we really developed our mind. But in those moments, we also pushed away at all the animal body and soul level connectedness, because we felt we had really arrived as a species. And I think of Rick Tarnas's book, Cosmos and Psyche. He really talks about this alienation of the modern person, the way we've become alienated through the good of differentiating out of our more animal nature has some positive, we've been able to do all these positive things, but now it's time to go back and bring back the soul nature and that rootedness in our earthiness.
Yeah.
And so we see that happening around us, because out of that kind of hyper-masculine, somewhat detached consciousness, we created all these systems and corporations that are dehumanizing. And so now, when you put your preschooler into one of those systems, they start to get enculturated with things that draw them away from their true self.
So maybe that part of that was a necessary stretching this way to give us some flexibility to stretch back the other way. Maybe that's all part of the evolution.
I tend to think so. I mean, you have to take a long view, or else and the challenges that we have now after going so far on this way, as you beautifully said, we have so many challenges to see, well, can we even get back? And then we'll almost certainly swing too far the other way and be adjusting to that sometime.
Yeah, but I have this faith that says at some point there's going to be like this full circle moment, and to me that moment will be when we have kind of stretched this way, and we've done that enough to come full circle and just arrive right here, right now.
Mm-hmm. That'd be beautiful. I'm all for it.
That's what I hope for. So I'd like to hear more about the work that you do and how you help people in their spiritual journey. I know you're a spiritual mentor, you're a coach, you do, what is it, mindfulness? It's called something very specific, which I liked a lot. Heartfulness, mindfulness with heart.
Well, yeah, even Brother David and also Jack Cornfield are now using that term heartfulness to give the idea of another word might be whole body mindfulness. So mindfulness, I think everyone that's a practitioner of mindfulness knows that we're talking about waking up the whole body and being mindful of the whole body, all 7 chakras. So mindfulness of sex, heart, mind, the whole animal. But from the outside to the newcomer to mindfulness, sometimes it sounds like it's just about tracking mental thoughts and things like that.
Yeah.
And that's where I really like heartfulness or whole body mindfulness better. So I do teach mindfulness. I teach in DePaul University in Chicago this year, and formerly at Loyola University. And that's just a lot of fun to introduce people to mindfulness, introduce students to mindfulness, and the students are so ready for it, and then I do workshops on mindfulness for individuals or mostly for groups. And again, it's just so much fun to introduce someone to something that can totally transform their life, totally transform their life, as it has done mine. I also teach centering prayer, which is you could say, a Christian form of mindfulness. That's not really rigorously true, but it is true that the people that developed the method of centering prayer, Thomas Keating, Basil Pennington, and William Menninger, they were practicing Christian or Buddhist mindfulness at the time that they developed the method of centering prayer. So again, that's something I really enjoy, being the person to show people that there is a whole treasure trove of secret, hidden, mystical teachings within the Christian faith and in Buddhism and other places that are very solid, reliable teachings, and to help people find their way to that.
Could you describe centering prayer a little bit? Is it somewhat like Eastern meditation? Somewhat?
It's a lot like that, and in Christianity, the word prayer, usually we think of that as spoken prayers or verbal prayers, but it actually can mean silent prayer too. So centering prayer is a form of contemplative prayer in which we rest in God's presence beyond words. And so there's just a bare framework or format or technique that is designed to help us just give ourselves to God in the moment and then rest in that presence. And so it is very simple, and people sometimes say, well, what do I actually do? And you sit in a comfortable posture, breathing, maybe watching your breath, and then in centering prayer we use a sacred word, not as a mantra, but as a reminder of the intention with which we entered the prayer, which is to be in the presence of God and to allow God's transforming action in our life. So in essence, it's a kind of a prayer of, here I am, I offer myself to you.
And contemplative, meaning it's sitting kind of in contemplation?
And here there is, you could contemplate in the sense of active reflection. So watching the flow of the river, you contemplate and reflect on the constant flow and the nature of reality being one of constant flow and change. That's not contemplative prayer. This kind of contemplative prayer might start out as that, but it's a resting without thinking, resting without reflecting, beyond thoughts, words, and concepts. So we rest in silence, which Thomas Keating calls God's first language. We rest in silence, God's first language. And in the silence, there's a transmission or communication without words that transforms us and draws us into union. And so for a lot of people that practice centering prayer regularly, after some years or time, it depends on, it's different for everyone, they will begin to experience little moments when the subject-object, God, self dichotomy just dissolves, and they just feel they don't know where they end and God begins. And that's the beginning of the movement toward union.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. I was looking at your different kind of bullet points on spiritual mentoring. So I already touched on the embodied non-dual awakening, and then it looks like if someone comes to you for spiritual mentoring, you do a spiritual life assessment?
Sometimes I do. Basically I think a lot of us have made up our minds about what spirituality is and what our spiritual life is. And to me, spiritual life is all of your life, everything.
There's
Because
nothing not spiritual.
we're spiritual by nature, and the whole cosmos, even the parts that have gone astray, is spiritual in its origin. So if we're engaging in the place of relationship, you can consider that a spiritual practice. So using that assessment can help me find and help the individual find where have they consciously or unconsciously said that part of my life is not spiritual. Is it their sex life? Is it their relation life? Is it their work life? And then to say, well, what if we took going in and arguing for a raise as a spiritual practice and just saw what parts of yourself came up in that? Do you feel that you're not worth it? Do you feel that you wouldn't use the money towards an end that would bring more goodness to earth? How could that be, just for the experience, wouldn't it be interesting to go in and see how self-expression could be a new arena for spiritual growth?
Well, that's interesting. And that's so true. There's nowhere that spirituality is not. But somehow, sometimes in a person's psyche, they create certain areas of their life that they have...
They create blocks. And it might come up when a person changes intrapsychically, they've been transforming through their practice life for a while, and then all of a sudden their job doesn't no longer is a good fit for the person that they have discovered themselves to be at this time. So okay, well, if I'm going to try to be my true self on my mat and cushion, I want to go and commute to a job where I can be my true self and advance a purpose that brings more light and love to the world. So then the success, if I work for a company that I have that feeling about, the company's success is now connected to my personal mission or sense of purpose of creating more beauty and goodness in the world. And so I want my company to be successful. I want to be successful there. And I want all my colleagues to grow. and be successful. And so every interaction could be a place for spiritual growth.
Something that came to my mind, which is a curiosity about spirituality, and I know this is a focus a lot of times with spiritual teachers, there's a lot of talk of getting rid of the ego.
Mm-hmm.
Is that possible?
Yeah, there's a lot of talk of getting rid of the ego. Let me know what you find.
I personally think you kind of become friends with the ego.
Yeah. That's, well, if you figure that one out, give me a call. But
I've heard that
is,
so much, and for
yeah.
me, I don't think that that's a possibility as a human being to get rid of the ego. We have to be able to function in the world.
Right. Well, that's the thing. First of all, that word has been used so much. It's like the word God. We should spend 30 minutes defining it. But if I say, well, who is the one that wants to get rid of the ego? I don't see how that, when I say ego, I mean the self, or the sense of self, or the one that is doing my planning for tomorrow, the one that has opinions and preferences, and I don't see any healthy way to live without owning that self. And I think, so just in my experience, when I don't own that I do have a self, then that all goes to the world of shadow. And we have the contemporary situation with all the spiritual teachers getting in trouble. Ken Wilber a few years ago went so far as to say that he thought that nobody in the Eastern traditions was living without a self-sense, without an ego. And that what he thought they were doing was that these teachers in the Eastern tradition were taught by their teacher that they should reach an egoless state. And when they realized that they didn't, they pushed their students even harder to do what they were unable themselves to do. And he suggested those traditions were now transmitting down through the lineage a kind of sense that we should really be doing better than we are, because none of them have actually been able to get there. And that's my feeling. And I think the thing is, the ego could be so decentralized, as I was saying earlier. When you really wake up, the ego realizes it's not the end of the game. It's not the big player that it thought it was. And so it has a crucial role, though, in helping the individual personality navigate the experience of life. And it has, you need all the strength to your ego that you can possibly get to handle the energy that comes through and the challenges that come through.
Yeah. So I'm wondering if, thank you for clarifying that.
Yeah.
I'm also wondering if maybe the better question would be, how do we bring the true self more active in our life, more engaged in our life, and how do you define the true self?
Well, how do you define the true self? Good, thanks for the easy question. So I would say the true self has different aspects. The true self is, I practiced Zen for a long time. So there's emptiness, the formless realm, and when we sit in pure emptiness, we might really feel the fullness of the world of form as well, but there's no form present. And then when we're in the world of form, we might also be aware that this is just half, and that we're surrounded by vast emptiness even when we're in our bodies. So the true self, one side is the true self, the empty aspect. So having that experience and awareness integrated that I'm emptiness. That, not only is my body 99.99% empty space, but that I am able to sense that in some way and be connected to that birthless, deathless, timeless aspect of my being. And that's kind of the true self in emptiness. The other side is how does the true self show up in the body? And to me, that's just when we're at our very best. And it can be experienced variously as in flow states, in peak experiences. But I don't know, it'd be interesting to say, what about when we're wrestling, when we're really wrestling with a question? Couldn't that be, in a way, that could be our best self too?
Mm-hmm.
Because we're wrestling and we're trying to reconcile our different parts.
Yeah.
So I don't think it's easy to just point to one thing and say that's it.
Yeah. And I was thinking too, all being heightened in all of our senses.
Mm-hmm.
All of our physical senses. That to me is a true state of being.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So yeah. Interesting. And I ask these questions because I don't know if I've so much been a spiritual seeker as a human conditioning observer, an observer of the human conditioning, and wondering, what makes for a great, fulfilled, happy, joyful life, and what doesn't, and what is that about, and how come some people have that and some people don't, and kind of just observing that, and then having I guess some people would call it an awakening at a young age, where I just had that connection to what I knew was what I would call a larger self than the small self defined by my family.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't an intellectual thing, it was just like a pure experience. So that kind of gave me a reference point for life. And from that reference point, I just was an observer. So I have followed a lot of people, I've read, a lot of material, and it just seems like there's a lot of confusion in the area of spirituality on things like the ego and the true self and enlightenment. And some of it sometimes feels like it's setting us up to try and reach something else to make us feel worthy. And it seems to me that true spirituality is somehow making contact with innately knowing that you already are worthy, you always were. So.
Yeah, I think it's very tough to figure out what to say the positives are. And we were with Lama Surya Das over the weekend at a retreat, and he said, well, he liked to think about awakening as awakening to greater clarity. And that made me think about awakening as there's less of the negatives, number of negative things. Like there's more freedom because you're less controlled by the old programming. There's increased freedom of expression, and increased ability to make creative choices in life rather than being subjected to the programming from our adolescence. There are fewer hang-ups, so there is less unconscious, ideally, less unconscious behavior coming out of your system. But it's really hard to say. It's a more natural state. And it's not necessarily, the ego wants to know that it's going to pursue things that become adornments, so that you win a pin and a badge, and you're Eagle Scout, and then you're Eagle Spiritual Scout, and that wins you acclaim and fortune, and the Thomas Keating in Centering Prayer likes to talk about the first three chakras in a life centered around security, affirmation, and power.
And that's kind of our society.
And that's kind of our society. And it is true, we spend a lot of time there developmentally in kind of mastering those realms, but very few of us have really developed the further reaches.
Empowerment, heart, communication,
And then,
intuitiveness.
and then some of the what I'm excited about right now, one of the things is, well, okay, if you have a spiritual life, you should really own your power as well, because we need powerful people that are awake to all their senses and all their sensibilities to be out in the world advocating for change, and advocating not from an ego position, but from a position that can stare death in the face and advocate for the best thing for human life. That's what we really need. So we need to own our ego, own our power, own our sex, own our bodies, and not split those off as problematic or as less than. So I think that I think that those are some of the gifts of the modern age or the current time, and the gift of growing up maybe unchurched. For those that were unchurched, they didn't get acculturated about sex being bad, the body is bad, power is bad, and so they're ideally in a better position to really own their power.
Yeah, I think, see, now that seems very valid to me. That seems very, very true what you just said. And I don't often hear that, what you were just talking about and how you were just putting it. I don't often hear that talked about in the spiritual arena in that way. And I think what you said is so valid and so true. It really is. And that is something we need. Yeah. Thank you for clarifying that.
Well, for whatever reason, a lot of people come to spirituality because they're broken too, or traumatized. And so they need, they are looking for a safe place. And sometimes that means disowning their power for a time, or the trauma can be associated with powerful individuals, with the traumatizer, the perpetrator of the trauma. And so very understandably they get a negative association with power. But once we really know who we are, I mean, who better to be influencing the world in a positive way than people that are really awake to what life is really going on.
Yeah. And it also sounds like when you were defining it that way, it sounds like a place of, and I'm sure there's better terminology than this, but it sounds like a place of wholeness. Wholeness, a wholeness of being. And what just came to me, one of the main things about spirituality is presence. Fully present here now in your power. Yeah.
I think so. I mean, for me, spirituality is the science of human aliveness. So how do we find full aliveness? What is it, and how do we find it for ourselves and for others? How do we build a school that has structures that support the children in it coming into aliveness?
So that would eliminate shame.
So it would eliminate shame. Unless developmentalists find, that would eliminate shame.
Which I think is big and still very rampant in our society and in our school systems. Which then, shame that leads to fear and shutting down and not being in full empowerment. Yeah. And that's a very different way of looking at spirituality. At least what I see kind of in the mainstream. And that's what I really like about your work and what you're doing is the integration of things. And you also include psychology?
Well, so one of the big inspirations for my work is Wilber's integral theory of spirituality or consciousness. And so that includes some psychological wisdom in it. And so the developmental piece about growing up, that comes out of developmental psychology. I myself am not a psychologist. I've worked for grad schools of psychology for several years, but I don't know why I didn't end up a psychologist. I didn't.
Because wasn't it Carl Jung who kind of saw the psyche as the soul? Was that Carl Jung?
I think so.
I think so. Yeah, and since I was, only raised in the Western society, it's that's been my observer place, and so that's really what I know most of, but it seems like, we have the East and the West, and now we have that kind of coming together, and it's almost like neither one has kind of hit it right on the head.
Mm-hmm.
And so maybe we're learning from each other and from that developing a third thing, and it seems like that's where your work comes in.
Mm-hmm.
It's a nice balance of things.
Yeah, so it was interesting to me after being studying under a Zen teacher for a while, and the Zen approach is kind of to just ask you to transcend all your training and your ideas of who you are right from the beginning, and
kind of wipe the slate clean, sort of?
To get just to reduce you to zero, and in that zero moment there can be a breakthrough to your true identity. And then I did some reading, and I was wondering if I had chosen the wrong path, because I read that in the Catholic monastic community you'd often be quizzed early on about what your talents and gifts were, and be given assignments that allowed you to utilize your gifts. And I thought, that's so completely different than what I'm experiencing over here. I think I picked the wrong path. And I also, I also didn't trust myself. And that was part of what appealed to me about Zen, was I was in a good, and this is the thing about our path, we pick the teacher that can help us get to the next right place, and we have to be ready, like in square dancing, to let that partner go and move on to the next partner, and not get too fixated on it. We don't have to be, I just read, Brother David says he probably listened to the Eckhart Tolle audiobook 30 times.
Oh, really?
I know there was a period when we saw him a few years ago, he was listening to it about an hour a day. So to really dance with Eckhart Tolle until you feel you've received the fullness of the gift that he has for you. And then it might be time to move on to someone else for a while. And to honor that there could be many, many great teachers entering our lives over time. And not to expect any one of them to take us all the way necessarily. I mean, this is the one, the inner guru, the inner teacher, is the one that will take us all the way.
Yeah.
And even you look back and say, how did I ever know where to go 30 years ago? But we know, the knowing sense in us knows enough for where we are right now, for the next breath, the next step.
That's true.
And so from in the moment perspective, that's all we need to do, is to be here, to be in touch with our senses, and to make the right decision now.
Yeah, and to trust that. I think what can happen now is there's an interference with that, trusting that inner knowing. And then we end up not in the wrong place with the wrong people. Because we're not trusting that.
Yeah.
And so our life then becomes kind of out of sync.
Well, one of the ways that embodied awakening, very simple way, if I can describe it simply, very simple way that it shows up, is a re-owning of your perspective, of your primary perspective. And what I want to say about that is, if I ask you, like, do you want ice cream tonight? The first thought that comes through a person's head is usually what an expert says they should say. about do they want do they want ice cream tonight? I mean, for me, the answer is almost always yes, I want ice cream tonight. I want it, but then I'll say, but, you know, I'm watching my weight, so I'm gonna pass, but thank you. And so to just be honest about what we truly want, desire, feel in the moment, what our education does is it teaches us to disregard our own perspective for the expert perspective. And that's a third person perspective on reality, which is very valid. It's what the experts say. But that can become our voice, and we can lose our own nascent perspective and just become parrots for what the school has taught us to say about, you know, do I want a cigarette? You know, that nobody should smoke, right? It's a bad habit. There's lots of evidence. I'm glad that we have the third person perspective on that. But when it comes to matters of the heart, this is a matter, it's such an intimate matter for the individual. And we need to learn to listen to and respond to our own heart impulses on these things.
Yeah. I think that's what I was trying to say a little bit ago about our Western society, that we, have, in some strange way, lost that confidence in our own, following our own heart and looking outward to an expert to lead the way, which at times that's okay, but to totally dismiss and disown that you are the expert on your own heart. Nobody else can ever be that for you.